Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel on the Middle East and the world in a time of American disengagement. My name is Michelle Dunn. I'm a non-resident scholar with the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. We have a really wonderful panel today, and let me introduce the panelists just briefly. We have with us Dalia Dasa-Kay, who's a senior fellow at the UCLA Berkeley Center for International Relations and a former director of the RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy. Marwan Moasher, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Karim Sajjadpour, a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on Iran and U.S. foreign policy. Dimitri Trenin, who is the Director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, and Sinan Ulgen, who is a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, where his research focuses on Turkish foreign policy, nuclear policy, cyber policy, and transatlantic relations. So I'm going to have an initial conversation with the panelists, and then we will open it up to a broader discussion. I welcome your questions throughout. Please go ahead and put them in as you can through YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. There are various different ways to submit questions. Feel free to submit them throughout the panel, and after we've had our initial discussion, we'll turn to your questions. So I'd like to start with Dalia Dasa-Kay. Dalia, you just recently published an article with Foreign Affairs with the premise of this panel. You say that the United States is not withdrawing from the Middle East. Rather, it is remaining deeply involved, but perhaps not in constructive ways. And in fact, you say, quote, American withdrawal is not only a myth, it is preventing an important debate in Washington. So I'd like you to explain what did you mean by that?
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Carnegie. This is a great event. Wonderful to be here. Yeah, I think, of course, as foreign affairs often does, it may be overstates, but I do think that we need to have an accurate discussion of what's actually happening in the region. It is very clear there are major strategic shifts underway, both regionally and globally. The U.S. has different priorities. There is a strong interest across party lines, one of the few consensus areas in Washington that we need to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, specifically China, that the Middle East has not been a great return on investment after 20 years of failed interventions. This is kind of the consensus, but I think that while there is real fear, genuine concern in the region, especially among governments, that the U.S. is so-called abandoning the region or leaving the region, we really have to look at what's happening on the ground and what the record is. And here I'm, really just looking even at the record of the Biden administration to date. And what we see is a lot of continuity in terms of heavy military and security investments in this region. Our military footprint is still significant. We have tens of thousands of U.S. forces still based in the region. I don't think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is necessarily a preview of what's to come. We have great volatility, especially the confrontation with Iran, that I don't think is going to disappear anytime soon. In fact, it seems to be escalating. U.S. forces are vulnerable. We are in the midst of this confrontation. So whether we like it or not, I think the U.S. is tethered to this region in many ways. Now, the argument I make is that the debate really should be about how are we engaged in this region. And the concern that I and many others, and Michelle, you did a great report at Carnegie along these lines as well. Our concern is that we are doubling down on these very heavy security and military investments. We just, Biden administration went through with the $23 billion or is going through $23 billion arms sales to the UAE, a new air-to-air missile sale to the Saudis. The 1.3 billion in military in aid to Egypt is moving forward, largely untouched despite human rights concerns. And yet we don't put a lot of investment in the human security issues and the real issues of the 21st century that is affecting the day-to-day lives of people in this region. Climate change, youth unemployment, of course, pandemics. And we just don't have our priorities straight. And so that's really the argument I'm making, that not that we're leaving the Middle East, but that we're staying in this region in all the wrong ways.
So one of the another quote from your article that I was taken aback by, even though I guess I knew this on some level, but you say, for example, that the United States currently invests as much annually in military assistance to Egypt as it does in economic development assistance for the entire region. So, if the United States is trying to compete primarily with China in this region in the future, which is pouring a lot of economic development and infrastructure assistance in the region. How does this work? I mean, I'm trying to understand, why do you think the Biden administration is placing such emphasis on shoring up security partnerships versus economic development or other kinds of development? I mean, is the United States trying to contain the fallout in relationships from the very messy withdrawal from Afghanistan? Is it really primarily concerned with competing with Russia in the region? Is it trying to forestall more Arab uprisings? I mean, what do you see as the logic for this continued heavy investment in security relationships and arms sales in this region, as opposed to other kinds of engagement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, to be fair to the administration, they are trying to shift the focus. And there's a lot of talk about putting human rights at the center of foreign policy. We just haven't seen it executed in the Middle East yet. Why is a really difficult question. I think, I refer to a few issues in the paper. We have bureaucratic inertia, we have political considerations. We have a very large defense industry that is very supportive of the continuation of major arms sales. We have arguments that if we don't do it, others, particularly the Chinese, will. They'll fill the security vacuum. And the administration, of course, is listening to regional partners, as they should, engaging them. And they're hearing a lot of, we need commitment, we need assurances. And so the default option in Washington is usually, oh, you need commitment, you need assurances, we'll throw another arms sale at you, we'll throw another missile defense system. Now, of course, that's important. There are real security threats. I'm not trying to diminish that, to underestimate the threats that regional actors are facing. There are missiles. The Houthis are lobbing missiles over into Saudi territory. We have a serious drone problem in the region. It's threatening to everybody, especially drones among that non-state actors have. But what's happening is we have the toolkit. We just haven't exercised it well, right? USAID has a lot of great programs. They need to be empowered. We need to see a lot more of someone like Samantha Power running around the region, and not always our defense appointees. It's important to have those security commitments and have those discussions, but they're not balanced. And I think a lot of it is just kind of a mindset in Washington, is this is how we do assurance. And we need to get a little bit more creative about how we do those things. The other thing, I think definitely the China pressure is there. And I think there is a real concern that we are so focused on China and confronting China. China's kind of the new threat. It was the Soviets, it's Iran. There's always a reason that we have to keep arming our allies, because we have to worry about the next threat out there. Now, China is certainly a concern. It has increased its investments in the region significantly over the past decade, largely economic as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Its military engagement is still far more limited than the United States. So I don't think we should be alarmist about China. We certainly should be wary, especially of their capabilities in the surveillance arena. We should be wary of their future military ambitions in the region, but right now they're pretty limited. They have one military base, pretty small one, no match for the United States or our regional partners. And we maintain significant advantages over China. We have a better development model. We could be leveraging that model better. People prefer to have the American economic model, the Western model, American products. We are not leveraging that to the extent that we can. We're doubling down on these legacy partnerships with largely unaccountable and authoritarian leaders, frankly.
and we'll come back to you with more questions later. I want to turn now to Marwan Washer. And Marwan, you have written extensively about two major changes going on in the Middle East. One is really the end of the viability of a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the other one is the looming end of the sort of, or even the ongoing really end of rentierism, of the rentier economic model based on the declining role of oil. So, protecting the security of Israel and ensuring access to oil have always been two of the bedrock interests of the United States in this region, and they continue to be up till now. But as these two issues evolve, how do you see this changing U.S. interests in the region and the American role?
Two important developments, Michelle, that are changing the way the U.S. is looking at the region, and frankly, changing the way the region is looking at the U.S. as well. The first is what I think is the end of the two-state solution. Not just that, I mean, the United States was or is in the region primarily because of Israel, because of oil, because of stability in the region. All of these issues are being challenged today. Israel is no longer exceptionalized in the United States. Israel is no longer this beacon of light that it has portrayed itself to be. Today, the violation of human rights by Israel just cannot be ignored by the international community, by Israeli human rights organizations as well. 52% today of Middle East experts in the United States think that the two-state solution is no longer possible, not just me. And 77% of them think that if a two-state solution is impossible, then the alternative is a one-state reality that is akin to apartheid. There is a new generation in the United States, particularly in the Democratic Party, that no longer looks at Israel as an asset, that no longer is comfortable with an occupation. So the image of Israel is changing in the United States. Yes, we don't have a critical mass yet to mean that there will be significant policy changes in the near term. But I think over time, we are certainly witnessing, in my view, a generational shift in the way Israel is looked at in the United States. On oil, a lot of people say that oil is still there, that it is premature to say that the era of oil is over. And I'm not suggesting that it is over immediately, overnight. Of course, oil is still there. Of course, it's no longer at $140 a barrel, but still a lot of Middle East countries still use it as a primary tool. At the same time, I think we are witnessing the beginning of the end of patronage system and of rentierism in the Middle East. And I think it's becoming clear that an economic model based on patronage, based on giving favors in return for loyalty, is not sustainable. And I think we're already seeing signs of that. Gulf states. Today, many Gulf states are trying to diversify their economies. The United Arab Emirates is a case in point. Saudi Arabia is another case in point. Qatar is a case in point. All of these countries are trying to put in place economic reforms that will move them away from oil or dependence on oil in the short to medium terms. What they are facing, of course, is whether they can combine this with political reform, because economic reform alone is not going to do it in the absence of building a system of checks and balances and building real institutions in their countries. But because of all of that, and we should not also forget that the United States today is a net exporter of oil, of energy. For all these reasons, I do believe that the United States is looking at the region in a different way than it used to before. Dalia makes a point that the investments of the United States in the region, particularly on the military front, have not gone down, which is true. I also want to make the point that the United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan, from Iraq, that it is no longer having any grand initiatives regarding the Arab-Israeli peace process, and all it wants is to maintain a long-term truce in the region, that it is no longer dependent on Middle East oil as it used to in the past. I think there are, compelling reasons to state that the geostrategic importance of the region for the United States has weakened in the last decade or so.
Marwan, a moment ago, you were talking about Gulf states trying to diversify their economies. They're also diversifying their foreign relations quite a bit. I mean, if we look just in the past year, little more than a year, been some really big changes, right? We have the normalization agreements with Israel, particularly important, the UAE normalization with Israel. We have the end of the boycott of Qatar, and now we see some Gulf rapprochement with Turkey and so forth. What is going on here? Why do you see some people see these shifting regional alignments as related to the changing role of the United States? Some people see other causes behind it, but how do you see the importance of these things and the causes of these realignments, and how important they are?
First, I think it is important to realize, Michelle, that these foreign policy positions are changing, even in a short period of time. The United Arab Emirates' position on Yemen has changed in the last 5 years. Saudi Arabia's position on Qatar has changed in the last 5 years. The Abrahamic Accords with Israel, are also another case in point. The rapprochement with Turkey today that the United Arab Emirates is doing, even with Iran to some extent. I don't think we have reached a stage of, may I call it, maturity in foreign relations for many of the Gulf states who are still trying to cope with a changing global environment. The Trump administration has affected a lot of these positions. The Abrahamic Accords, I think, is clear, have come as a direct result of either appeasement of the Trump administration or an attempt to align themselves with Israel against a common enemy, which is Iran. All of these are still in flux. I don't think we have reached a degree of stability to basically be clear about what the Gulf in general and particular countries, what their foreign policy is on any given issue. That is still not very clear. What is clear to me, at least, is that the notion that the Abrahamic Accords are going to drive peace, in other words, economic interests will be a positive factor with regard to peace. I think that this notion is not consistent with the historical record. Jordan and Egypt have signed peace agreements. Egypt since 81, Jordan since 94. And both these agreements promised huge economic benefits for their peoples. It just has not materialized, because in the end, these agreements are going to, face the wall of the conflict, that there is a political conflict, and that without solving that conflict, economic interests can only go that far and will not have the possibility of sort of signaling in a new Middle East that ignores the fact of the Middle East conflict, and that attempts to just park the conflict aside while it pursues other economic interests. I think that notion is not going to work.
Thanks, Marwan. Well, Iran has come up a couple of times now, and I'd like to bring Karim Sajjadpour into the conversation. So, Karim, it's been nearly a year since the Biden administration came to office intending to get back into the a nuclear agreement with Iran, and yet things have not gone as smoothly or as quickly as I think a lot of people expected. Are the two parties any closer than they were a year ago? I mean, how do you see the situation now? Talks have resumed recently. And what happens if it doesn't happen, if there just is no new nuclear agreement?
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's wonderful to see you again. I think at the moment, if you were to talk to certainly Western negotiating teams, they wouldn't express optimism that this deal is close to being revived. I spoke to a senior U.S. official about 6 weeks ago about it, and he put the odds at around 15%. So 15%, not very high. If we look back at what was the formula that spawned the JCPOA in 2015, there were a few key factors. Number one, Iran was under significant global pressure. It wasn't just U.S. pressure, but it was global pressure. China and Europe had essentially stopped importing Iranian oil. A second factor was there was rigorous diplomacy between direct diplomacy between the United States and Iran. And number three, I think the Obama administration had made clear to Iran that they did have a clear end game. This was only about reaching a nuclear deal. It wasn't going to be about anything else. And at the moment, those factors don't exist. Certainly there is global pressure against Iran, but the reality is that Iran's oil exports to China have increased fourfold or fivefold, depending on your figures. So Iran doesn't have the same sense of economic urgency they felt in 2015 when they signed the JCPOA. The Biden administration has really tried to have direct diplomacy, direct dialogue with Iran. But as far as we know, the Iranians have refused direct dialogue with the United States. So despite the fact that all parties are in Vienna, America and Iran are actually not talking directly to one another. And you could say, well, that's perhaps not a critical factor, but I have spoken to U.S. negotiators who say, it's actually difficult to convey sensitive points via a third party when you can't have that dialogue directly. It's lacking. And the final thing I'd say is that on one hand, it's true that the Biden administration has made clear their end game, which is to revive the JCPOA. But at the same time, the Biden administration came into office saying they wanted not only to revive the JCPOA, but they wanted a longer and stronger agreement. And so for the Iranians, not only is it perhaps not clear what the U.S. endgame is, but there's also profound mistrust because Tehran felt that it signed this agreement with the Obama administration. Iran abided by it, and the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from it. And so this has really been the dominating factor of U.S.-Iran relations the last decades, this profound mutual mistrust, which, at the moment, I don't think it's ever going to go away as long as the Islamic Republic is in power. But, how do you mitigate that if you're the United States, if you don't have direct dialogue with Iran?
So then let's widen the aperture a little bit. Okay, it's not only about the United States and Iran. Let's talk about the dynamics inside the P5+1. So the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, who have been engaged, in this process with Iran for a long time now. How do you see the dynamics now? I mean, is this still a useful and necessary grouping? How likely are the parties to be able to agree on the shape of a deal with Iran? And indeed, to what extent do you think this grouping, this P5+1 grouping, could cooperate on Middle East regional security in a broader sense?
It's a terrific question, Michelle. And what I'd say is that if you look at the P5+1, as you mentioned, it's the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. So China, Russia, Britain, France, United States, who am I missing? Yeah, China, Russia. So, these are 6 countries which really have divergent interests vis-a-vis Iran. China and the United States see Iran very differently. China sees Iran actually as a force for stability in the Middle East and economic energy partner. Russia is partnered with Iran in Syria. So they see these 6 countries have divergent interests vis-a-vis Iran, but the lowest common denominator which brought them together as the P5+1 was the fact that they all wanted to avert a nuclear-armed Iran. And you could argue they also wanted to avert military action against Iran. So that was kind of the lowest common denominator which brought them together. But what's complicating things at the moment, I'd say, on one hand, they still all share that lowest common denominator. None of these countries want to see a nuclear-armed Iran or see Iran get bombed. But, for example, the bilateral tension between China and the United States complicates things. U.S. officials would say, China doesn't want to do us any favors on Iran. Likewise, the tension between Russia and the United States complicates things, nor does Russia want to do the United States any favors. What I would argue as kind of a policy prescription, first on the nuclear file and then to look at the regional context, is that I think China will probably need to feel that if it continues importing Iranian energy at the same level it's importing now, and Iran continues to not feel a sense of urgency to compromise, then this could well trigger military action, more likely Israeli military action than US military action, which would skyrocket the price of oil, which is not in Chinese interest. So that's the stick. The carrot is that US partners in the Middle East, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE, just as they did 5-6 years ago, can easily go to the Chinese and say, we can provide you the same oil which the Iranians are now providing you. So I think really the one of the key tasks of the Biden administration is not necessarily to change Iranian calculations, but to change Chinese calculations, because that's really what will change Iranian calculations. Now, briefly on the regional context, the question, Michelle, is whether there is, the same way there was a lowest common denominator which brought these 6 countries together to try to avert a nuclear-armed Iran, is there a lowest common denominator which brings countries together in a regional sphere? And I would say that there should be a lowest common denominator, and that it certainly is not in Chinese interest to have this constant threat of conflict in the Middle East, which has in the past disrupted the free flow of energy from the region. We saw in 2009, Iran launched an attack on Saudi Aramco. They've gone after oil tankers in the past. And so I think the 2 key words are stability and sovereignty. Stability and sovereignty certainly are words that the Chinese feel strongly about. And now I think that despite the broader US-China competition, when it comes to the Middle East, I think there's great overlapping interest between Washington and Beijing. I think there's more of a question about, to what extent do the United States and Russia share common interests in the Middle East? And here I'd be very curious to hear from our colleague, Dmitry Trenin, because I'm a little more skeptical when it comes to Russia. I think Russia actually benefits from US-Iran tension. It increases the risk premium of oil prices. And, as I mentioned, it can be beneficial for Russia to see Iran as a thorn in the side of the United States.
Thanks, Karim. And I'll be back to you with some questions. But actually, you've raised Russia, and let's go there. Let's go to my colleague, Dmitry Trenin. director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. And let's talk about that, Dmitry. Let's talk about how you see Russian interests and whether you see overlap between Russian and American interests. I mean, let's start with the very difficult issue of Syria. There are some people who say that both Moscow and Washington are satisfied with a frozen conflict in Syria because they really, don't see how to get beyond that. But while the conflict in Syria is in some ways frozen, there still are hostilities taking place, and Russia is still involved in military operations in the north. And then there are the Russian relations with Turkey over Syria, which is and of course over the whole arms sales to Turkey and the tension that's created between the United States and Turkey, as well as Russia and Turkey. So, how do you see this situation of Russian interests, American interests, and Russia's main relationships in the region right now?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation, which I think is exceptionally rich. In my view, Russia does not have some sort of a regional strategy for the region, for the Middle East. It follows very specific interests in various parts of the region. It follows broadly its national interest. It does not seek to be Soviet Union incarnate. It doesn't want to take responsibility for the region. It doesn't want to, and certainly doesn't have the resources to supplant the United States in the role of a security provider region-wide. What it follows, I would say again, is a very particular, very special interest in various parts of the Middle East. With regard to Syria, I think you can say that Russia is satisfied not so much with the frozen conflict, but with its ability, which I think outpaced the imagination of many Russians, including, he admitted that, President Putin himself, their imagination in 2015 as Russia intervened in Syria with its military forces. So Russia is satisfied with having achieved military success. I don't think that Russia's goal is to rehabilitate Syria, turn Syria into some sort of a prosperous country in the Middle East, rebuild it. Russia clearly recognizes that it doesn't have the resources, and it didn't go to Syria to make Syria great. It went there for very special, very specific reasons. Some of those reasons had to do with the fear of the Islamists in Syria, ISIS, in those days, eventually overrunning Damascus and establishing the caliphate in Damascus. And many of those militants, terrorists, were former Soviet or Russian even citizens. So that's one reason. Another reason for that was to show the world that Russia was back as a great power and that it could act beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union. And that did succeed. And the third motivation for Russia was to basically send its new image as a capable actor to other countries in the Middle East. Again, Russia, I think, has succeeded in all three counts. With regard to Syria and relations with Turkey, again, Russia deals with a number of players in Syria: the Syrian government itself, Iran, and Turkey, and the United States, and Israel, and Saudi Arabia. A number of very, very different powers, regional and global. With Turkey, Russia has, of course, a very long-standing relationship that it has had ups and downs. It had periods of war, it had periods of alliance. Russia treats Turkey as a serious power in the region. It respects Turkey's, let's say, power to do things and its activism throughout the region. Relations with Turkey, of course, are very complex. They range from cooperation to competition to confrontation. And Russia, if you like, compartmentalizes that relationship. In some areas, it cooperates with Turkey very closely, like selling it its advanced weapon systems and building a nuclear power plant in Turkey. In other areas, such as the Caucasus, it competes with Turkey, former Soviet territory. And in some instances, in Syria, it collides with Turkey, even kinetically, physically collides with Turkish agents or Turkish forces. So it's a complex relationship. What makes it manageable is that both sides speak, particularly the leadership in Turkey and in Russia, speak the language of realpolitik. They are guided by their interests, and Russians acknowledge that, even if they do not always agree with those interests. And this direct relationship between Putin and Erdogan, I think, is the cornerstone of the current relationship between Ankara and Moscow. And these two men manage the otherwise very, very difficult relationship. But Russia, and this is where I will end, Russia has learned to balance its relations with multiple partners and counterparts in the Middle East. This is something that it learned in the post-Soviet period. Rather than taking a side and opposing a number of others, it seeks and finds ways to collaborate with just about everyone in the region. And it balances Israel versus Iran. It balances Iran versus Turkey. It balances the Gulf states versus Iran, Hezbollah, the Kurds, you name it. And that is the new face of Russian diplomacy and of Russian foreign policy. So far, in my view, it has been rather successful within the limited goals that Russia is setting for itself, and with very limited resources that Russia can commit to its foreign policy in the Middle East.
Thank you, Dimitri. And we're actually going to turn, speaking of no problems with neighbors, we're gonna turn to Turkey in a moment. But I have one more question I want to ask you. There's been this intriguing little development of launching a new department in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs concerned with Russia's soft power. How do you see this as part of current Russian thinking about foreign policy, and in particular, how would it apply to policies in the Middle East?
Well, I would make too much of that. I think Russia is essentially following the trend rather than being in the vanguard of that trend. Russia has a few instruments of soft power that it uses with more or less success. It has alternative information outlets, alternative to most Western outlets, and that includes RT Arabic. Russia, in the past, and maybe to some extent now, and hopefully in the future, has opportunities to train students from the region. Even today, you go to various countries in the region, and they're they have aged, of course, but there are lots of people who've been through Soviet training institutions, educational institutions, doctors, not even primarily military people, not officers, although there have been a number of officers in various Arab countries, but say doctors and engineers and all that. There is an interesting new element to the Russian foreign policy toward the Middle East, the use of religion. So Russia is an observer with the Organization of Islamic cooperation. And there are regions within Russia that are predominantly Muslim, and these regions have leaders who often travel to the region and engage with, on Russia's behalf, on Moscow's behalf, with various leaders in various countries. They take part in the Hajj and all that. That includes the Chechen leader, but not only him, many others, Tatarstan and Dagestan and many others. There is some attractiveness in Russia that it's colorblind when it comes to political values. It does not insist on speaking primarily or in a privileged way to diplomatic leaders, or shunning authoritarians, or teaching, mentoring them, and whatever. Everyone is welcome. All come to the tent, and that can be attractive. There's certain attractiveness, of course, from classical Russian culture, which of course is on the waning side in these days of TikTok and other things. But these, I think, are the main instruments that Russia is playing. Again, I wouldn't make too much of that, but Russia in a world that's getting more diverse, not so much trying to emulate the West in every part of the planet. It has it can have certain traction in certain quarters, particularly in that part of the world where many people are irritated with the West, or fearful of China or whatever. I mean, Russia goes there and has an audience.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'd like to bring in now Sinan, our panelist on Turkey. And wow, Sinan, there's so much going on in Turkey and related to Turkey. Let's start with the domestic scene. So President Erdogan seems to be taking a good bit of blame domestically as well as internationally for the very difficult economic situation, for the tanking of the currency, the high inflation, deteriorating living standards that Turkish citizens are experiencing. And yet he seems to be in no mood to back down from his unorthodox policies. I think from what I saw even today, he reiterated in Doha that he believes that sticking with low interest rates is the way, that goes against sort of economic orthodoxy. Now, I know you're not an economist. The question is, what are the domestic political consequences likely to be? We are seeing some opposition, mobilization, some speculation by analysts that there will be political consequences for Erdogan. There might even be earlier elections, that there might be a push for even changes to the political system. I'm curious how you see the political consequences of the economic situation playing out over the next year or so.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Actually, my first degree is in economics, so I also perfect. Occasionally speak about economics, but mostly about the political economy, obviously. Indeed, what we've seen in the past few weeks is a new economic program in Turkey espoused by Erdogan, which, according to his narrative, is going to lower interest rates, depreciate the domestic currency, increase Turkey's international competitiveness, and through the export channel, increase production and ultimately employment and welfare. Obviously, so he believes that as a result, the country needs to lower interest rates, and then inflation will follow. However, this narrative, this type of economic policy obviously has a number of problems. It is more likely to end up in tears rather than in this, rosy picture of Turkey creating more wealth, more employment, and more exports. But the reason why the government and the leadership under Erdogan has essentially decided to go down this path is all related to the political domestic landscape. Today, Erdogan is in a rather unprecedented position after almost 20 years at the helm of the Turkish politics, that there are at least three candidates on the side of the opposition that do seem to beat him in the polls. The two of them are the mayors of Ankara and Istanbul, and the third one is the chairwoman of the opposition İYİ Party, Mrs. Akşener. This is unprecedented because Erdogan was always quite strong. He polled very well, and he won, almost all elections that he participated in over the last 2 decades. Secondly, this is also giving rise to an empowered opposition. And thirdly, this very difficult position of the ruling party and Erdogan in advance of the elections that are set for mid-2023, if there aren't going to be any anticipated elections, actually is if you want, the environment which forces him to generate growth at any expense. And I think at the bottom is really this idea that Turkey needs growth, even if it does give rise to inflation, which may ultimately come down on the basis of that growth, or at least that's the thinking. So I think this is the major dilemma, that yes, Turkey will have a quite strong growth this year, probably in double digits. But a lot of that is due to the base effect when last year the economy was under the COVID shock. So it's much more important to generate growth next year. And the way that you generate growth also goes the narrative is by lowering interest rates, incentivizing a rather lax monetary policy. We'll probably see also a degree of fiscal profligacy, and therefore the fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, will create the right conditions for growth, which would then be translated, again, according to the government expectations, which will then be translated into higher popular support.
So a strategy of growth no matter what. So let's relate this also to Turkey's foreign relations. There's a lot going on there as well. There are major issues between Turkey and the United States. You've written a lot about that. I'd be curious to see, how you see that. A lot of issues between Turkey and Europe. We have this Council of Europe now infringement proceedings against Turkey due to Turkey's refusal to release the philanthropist Osman Kavala. And then at the same time, there are other sort of diplomatic opportunities for Turkey. We see a bit of a rapprochement between Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, while Turkey continuing to have strong relations with Qatar. How do you see the foreign relations picture for Turkey, and how will Erdogan try to use that to improve the situation for himself inside the country?
Let me start by what Turkey is doing, and then perhaps a little about what Turkey's interlocutors are doing in response to Turkey's different initiatives. On the Turkish side, we've definitely seen a change, both in narrative, but in rhetoric, but also in action on the foreign policy side since the beginning of this year. A lot of that is due to probably about two factors. The first one is really the acknowledgement that the past policies of, aggressive, combative, tension-prone foreign policy, which may have played out well domestically, has, at the end of the day, been inimical to Turkey's interests, because Turkey ended up being quite isolated in its region, both in terms of its, bilateral ties with many of the countries in the region, but also its traditional partners in the West. So that's, on the foreign policy side, but also to link what we've discussed earlier on, there's also an acknowledgement that having these type of more combative foreign policy relationship with Turkey's major economic partners. Those partners are, Turkey's export markets, they're Turkey's investment partners, they're Turkey's technology partners, has also been inimical for the Turkish economy. And therefore, since the beginning of this year, we have really seen a shift towards a more calibrated, a more perhaps smart approach to, Turkey's foreign relations. Now, this is on the Turkish side. But this is obviously the full picture. In order to give the full picture, we also need to say about how this, Turkey's ambitions and aspirations have been responded by Turkey's partners. And there's a, much more mitigated picture. Some of the countries, and here, lately, obviously, the UAE is one. But some of those countries have responded well to Turkey's overtures. We can discuss why that's been the case for the UAE. Some others, like Israel and Egypt, where we haven't really seen much traction, to tell you the truth. And then in the West as well, I think both on the European side and the US side, despite, again, the softening of Turkish rhetoric, this, willingness on the side of the Turkish government to sit down, discuss, and deliberate, there hasn't been much opening, both on the European side and the US side. And I think there, as we approach this, rather critical threshold for Turkey with the presidential and legislative elections, many of the capitals in the West are looking to hedge their bets. And therefore, they're not so much willing to take, a risk or an initiative to discuss at length and in depth with the Turkish government the outstanding issues, with, prospect of political change looming.
Thank you, Sinan. We are going to move now into questions from the audience. So audience members have been submitting questions, so I'm going to start posing them, but I want to encourage those who are watching to submit more questions. We have a good bit of time. We have 30 minutes left for Q&A, so please go ahead and continue to submit questions. So Dalia, I'm going to start with you again, and I'd like to throw at you a few different questions that have arisen that are related to you or posed to you. One question specifically posed to you, Dalia, was about the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan on U.S. security relationships in the region, particularly with the Gulf. Is there any impact, or has that just been processed? Another question, unrelated question, is some of the questioners are challenging a little bit your assertion that the American economic model is more attractive. And the question's been raised, well, what about, the Chinese model, which suggests that it's possible to have a lot of economic growth without inclusive political reforms and so forth? Isn't that attractive? And isn't that viable? So these are two questions for you, Dalia.
Okay, thank you. Great questions. So just to make something clear also in response to, the general argument about the region being less strategically important, I think Marwan made that point really well. I think we can all agree that's definitely the mindset in Washington now. The region is viewed as less significant. There's an interest in shifting to Asia. But what I am arguing is there's a lag time in the way in which you do that. And our tools have very much remained the same. And I think this is where we can have a lot of very dangerous developments. For example, the few thousand forces we still have left in Iraq are quite vulnerable to attacks by Iranian-aligned militia. In fact, the first military strike launched by the Biden administration anywhere was in the Middle East in response to attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq. So I think, this is the kind of assessment we need. Yes, in the very, very long term, maybe we'll be out of the Middle East. But for right now, we're very much in the Middle East, and we're in the Middle East in very dangerous ways. So the Afghanistan withdrawal, no question, had a huge impact. I was just at several conferences and workshops in the region over the past couple of weeks. And that was, of course, the overwhelming concern was, what does this mean for our relationships, especially in the Gulf? At the Manama Dialogue, you heard a lot about this. And National Security Advisor Brett McGurk gave a speech to try to reassure. Secretary Austin gave a speech, lots of assurance messages. I will say it did seem to have fallen flat with the audience. The administration's defense of its position in Afghanistan was not, I don't think, read as too reassuring from a regional lens. So I think those concerns are genuine. But I think we also have to look at reality, which is we are not disengaging militarily from those partnerships. The region is hedging. It always has hedged. In fact, especially since the 2003 Iraq War, you saw extensive hedging of Gulf relationships, in particular with China and Russia. That's continuing actively today. And that's just going to be the new norm in the region. We have lots of realignment, lots of hedging going on to prepare for these very, very big shifts and need to focus energies elsewhere, diversify economies, focus domestically, et cetera. So I think, yes, there's worry, but there's also understanding that the U.S. presence doesn't shift overnight, and that a lot of this activity is not just driven by U.S. withdrawals. There's not everything is about the United States in this region. There's a lot of domestic drivers behind things as well. On the model, yeah, you hear that a lot.
Elliot, sorry to interrupt you, but before you go on to China, let me just ask you a follow-up question about this one, about the regional realignment. And again, to look at the UAE-Israel normalization, you said that everyone's hedging, and I think that's quite right. Is that, how do you see the UAE normalization with Israel? Is that hedging as well in terms of the future security of the Gulf, as well as economic development with a possibly different American role?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful to not lump all of these de-escalation, normalization developments together and say and argue they're one phenomenon. So when I'm talking about hedging, I think definitely a lot of that is going on when it comes to relationships with China and Russia. So those kinds of realignments. Possibly Turkey, UAE, interesting normalization process. Certainly, UAE normalizing with Syria is an interesting development. Also, a recognition of certain realities on the ground. The UAE-Israel phenomenon, I think, is somewhat unique. I don't think there was a broad. My understanding of what was driving this. I mean, what drives these processes and how they evolve are two different things. But what originally drove this process was less an ambition to have a big strategic architecture with Israel in the Middle East. I don't think that's still terribly realistic, even with growing acceptance of Israel's role in the region. I think, the UAE was the real driver behind these agreements. And they were very, very close to the Trump administration, behind a lot of or closely aligned with many Trump administration policies in the region. They were uncertain of where things were to come. And so in a way, it was a hedging strategy, but a hedging strategy in terms of the American domestic system, because normalization with Israel would be something that's obviously welcomed across the political spectrum in Washington. These were arrangements that were ongoing for many years, so it brought it to the light of day. It was a bold move in that sense, but it was an effort to hedge, I think, in the American political system more than to try to launch some new security architecture in the region. I think that these agreements will mostly focus, hopefully, on economic issues that will hopefully benefit the broader region and hopefully the Palestinians as well. That's, I think, yet to be seen. There are some darker aspects when it comes to surveillance technologies that are being exported by Israel to the region, including to these Gulf Arab partners. That's extremely worrisome. Again, that was going on before normalization. It's likely to continue after, but that's something we need to keep our eye on.
Okay, sorry, go ahead and answer the China or the economic model question now.
Yeah, I'll just be quick on that. So, you hear that a lot, what we can have our cake and eat it too. We can keep our authoritarian model and grow. One, I think it's yet to be seen where China's going to go. But two, the problem with the way in which China is investing in this region is it's supporting a lot of big state infrastructure projects. It's not trickling down to the local level. It's not creating job creation. It's not dealing with the day-to-day issues that people in this region are grappling with. So, models that can create more sustainable growth, that don't just benefit large state overinflated, large state bureaucracies and corrupt leaders, are more likely to be sustainable over the long run in terms of healthy societies, healthy economies. So I think that's the argument. It's a long-term argument. It's certainly short-term. There's a lot of incentives to go the Chinese way, which is why I think you're seeing a lot of openness to China in the region right now.
Thanks, Dalia. Marwan, I'd like to turn to you. I have a couple of different questions for you, but let me start first. There are some of our participants are pushing back a little bit on whether the two-state solution is really over for Israel-Palestine, asking, why are you so eager to bury the two-state solution? Another questioner asking, okay, I accept that, or if the two-state solution is indeed over, then what is the alternative?
Thank you, Michelle. It's not a matter of being eager to bury the two-state solution. I think many of those who ask the question know that I'm a two-stater by training and by profession. I've spent, the most of my professional life trying to help affect a two-state solution. So it's not an emotional issue. I'm just a realist. I'm looking at the facts on the ground, and the facts on the ground tell me that a two-state solution is no longer possible. The international community doesn't want to acknowledge this. Arab states don't want to acknowledge this, and many in Israel don't want to acknowledge this. Why? Because if people acknowledge that the two-state solution is over because of political, demographic issues, then they will have to come to terms with what is the alternative. And nobody wants to talk about the alternatives. And that is why what we have been doing in the last decade or so is giving the two-state solution lip service while doing nothing to ensure its implementation on the ground. Frankly, I'm going, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again very boldly, the international community is helping kill the two-state solution by giving it lip service without putting in place a process that assures its implementation. I think there are two drivers today that are going to increasingly determine the fate of whatever alternative people arrive at. And it's not for me or anybody else to say what the alternative is. This is a process that is going to be decided by the Israelis and the Palestinians. But we cannot ignore two main drivers. One is demography. Today, the number of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is 700,000 people, close to 25% of the population of the West Bank. These include 250,000 in East Jerusalem alone. And so even if a political will exists today to separate the two communities, separating them is no longer possible in my view. If you couple that with a lack of seriousness on part of the Israelis to affect a two-state solution, the Israeli government is very clear today. It has no intention to withdraw from occupied territory. It has every intention to annex as much of the West Bank as possible, and then adhere to a two-state solution that means nothing for the Palestinians because it's not a viable solution for them. a solution that does not include East Jerusalem or settlement land or the right of return or sovereignty over their land and air, the young generation today in the West Bank and Gaza are increasingly, and all the polls show that, not interested in such a two-state solution. So that's going to be one of the main drivers in the future, the demographics. There is another demographical factor which we also or sometimes ignore. The number of Palestinian Arabs in areas under Israel's control today is larger than the number of Israeli Jews. Today, you have 7.4 million Palestinian Arabs in Israel proper, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and in Gaza, as opposed to 6.8 million Israeli Jews and 300,000 to 400,000 Israeli citizens who are not Jews and not Arabs. Israel used to say in the past, we are counting apples and oranges. You cannot equate the Palestinians who are today citizens of Israel with the Palestinians who are in Gaza, for example, or even in the West Bank. Well, the last events, the last clashes in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in last May or this May, have proved that the line separating the different components of Palestinian communities is a rather fuzzy one. There is another factor that is going to increasingly drive the future of the conflict: human rights. Human rights and violation of these rights by Israel in particular in the occupied territories has been ignored for the longest time by the international community, in the hope that a two-state solution would make that issue moot. That is, if we are working for a two-state solution, then we might as well ignore violations of human rights. We might as well ignore the occupation, because in the end, it's not going to matter if the two sides will have their own states. But it's been 30 years since Oslo. Oslo was supposed to end in 1999 with a solution to the conflict. It's been a long time since then. It's been almost 30 years since Oslo was launched. And the international community is going to find it very difficult, increasingly, to ignore human rights that are being violated on a daily basis by Israel. Today, the word apartheid is no longer taboo. It has been used by Israeli human rights organizations. It has been used by Human Rights Watch, by B'Tselem, and to some extent by Carnegie as well. So we are in a different mindset today, where the international community cannot indefinitely ignore these violations, and where the Palestinians, who will become or are already a majority in areas under Israel's control, are going to say to the world, if we cannot have our own state, then we are going to start asking for equal rights. But the international community cannot say no to a Palestinian state and no to equal rights, because that is saying yes to apartheid. That is where I see the conflict going. That does not mean that these developments are going to result in a new reality anytime soon. But today we are in a one-state reality. Today, the question today is increasingly becoming not whether we're going to have two states or not, but what kind of a state is this new reality going to be? Is it going to be a democratic state, or is it going to be an apartheid state? That is the question that we are all facing. And to those that say that this is far-fetched, a one-state reality solution, what have you, I frankly will push back, have been pushing back for years now, and tell them, give me a practical plan that is going to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state that is viable and accepted by the Palestinians. Absent that plan and absent the political will by Israel, by the international community to end the occupation, I see no alternative but moving to a one-state reality. And the question, as I said, will become, whether that one-state reality will end up being a democratic state or an apartheid state.
Thank you, Marwan. There's another question, and this would turn your attention more to the Arab political realm, and it's about your book. Recall your book. The questioner recalls your book on the Arab Center. Marwan, do you still believe in an Arab Center? And as this center, the questioner believes, is shifting to the right?
Well, my book has redefined or attempted to redefine the Arab Center. What I have said in the book is that the Arab Center is a term that has been used by the West to describe those countries that are making peace with Israel. And as long as you are making peace with Israel, it does not matter what your domestic policies are, particularly with regard to reform and particularly with regard to political reform. What I have argued very clearly in the book, especially in the last 2 chapters, is that if the Arab Center is to survive, it has to shed away its preoccupation with only one issue, which is the peace process, and it has to widen the aperture to include good governance in its, in their countries. And unless it does that, unless it couples peace with reform, that an Arab Center has no chance of surviving. That is what I have argued in 2008 when I wrote the book, and that is what I still believe in today.
Thank you, Marwan. I want to thank all of our panelists, Sinan Ugan, Dimitri Trenin, Karim Sajadpour, Marwan Moasher, and Dalia Dasakay for really a wonderful conversation. Thank you all very much. And please stay tuned. The next panel on the growing threat of nuclear proliferation is coming up in just a few moments. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Michelle.